In January 1944, as winter tightened its grip across Europe, thousands of German soldiers sat in unheated barracks, rail wagons, and makeshift holding camps, waiting for a journey they believed would be worse than death. They did not know exactly where they were going. Some suspected Canada, others imagined distant colonies. But when rumors spread that Britain might be their destination, fear hardened into certainty. Britain, they had been told for years, was a land of calculated cruelty, a place where German prisoners were starved, humiliated, beaten, and quietly erased. For many of these men, the thought of crossing the Channel alive felt like a temporary delay before inevitable suffering. By the final years of the war, the German army had absorbed defeat on a scale never publicly admitted. Millions were dead or captured. Yet even as military reality collapsed, belief remained firm. From their first days in uniform, German soldiers had been conditioned not only to fight Britain, but to fear it. This fear was not vague. It was detailed, structured, repeated. It came from official briefings, newspapers, films, training lectures, and whispered warnings from officers. Britain was portrayed not simply as an enemy, but as a morally corrupt empire that hid brutality behind politeness, a nation that smiled while it crushed those in its power. German propaganda did not need to exaggerate violence graphically. It worked more subtly. British society, soldiers were told, was built on hypocrisy. Germans were warned that capture by the British meant slow psychological destruction, forced labor, isolation, religious mockery, cultural humiliation. They were told that British guards enjoyed breaking prisoners not with fists, but with rules, boredom, and calculated coldness. It was said that British camps were designed to erase identity, to reduce men to obedient shadows who forgot who they were. For years, these ideas went unchallenged. Most German soldiers had never seen Britain. Their understanding came entirely from controlled sources. Radio broadcasts described British cities as decayed, immoral, and hostile to foreigners. Films portrayed British officers as smug and sadistic, obsessed with hierarchy and punishment. Even neutral accounts were framed as warnings. Britain, soldiers were told, pretended to follow international law while secretly ignoring it. The Geneva Convention, they heard, was a piece of paper Britain interpreted however it pleased. This message served a purpose. Fear of capture kept soldiers fighting longer. It discouraged surrender. It strengthened obedience. And by the later stages of the war, when defeat became obvious, it also prepared soldiers psychologically for loss. If capture meant suffering, then continued resistance, even hopeless resistance, could still be justified. By 1943 and 1944, this conditioning was deeply internalized. Many German soldiers believed British captivity would be worse than Soviet captivity in certain ways, not because of physical violence, but because of humiliation. The British, they believed, would strip them of dignity, mock their culture, and force them to confront defeat daily. British politeness itself was framed as a weapon, a way to assert superiority. These beliefs followed soldiers onto the battlefield. When units collapsed in North Africa, Italy, and later Western Europe, men did not surrender lightly. Those who did often did so only when surrounded, wounded, or ordered by officers who saw no alternative. Even then, fear did not disappear. It sharpened. Capture was rarely a single moment. It was a process: disarmament, search, waiting, movement between temporary holding areas. For German soldiers captured by British forces, the first hours were confusing. They were often exhausted, hungry, and disoriented. Yet many later accounts reveal something striking. The fear they felt was not primarily physical, it was psychological. They were waiting for something terrible to happen, waiting for the behavior they had been promised. Instead, what they encountered was uncertainty. British soldiers were not monsters, but neither were they friendly. They were professional, distant, often silent. Orders were given calmly, procedures followed. For some German prisoners, this restraint was unsettling. They expected anger, revenge, insults. Instead, they encountered routine. This did not reassure them. It confused them. Confusion was dangerous to belief, but belief did not collapse immediately. It adjusted. Many prisoners interpreted British restraint as preparation. Kindness they assumed would come later. The real cruelty would emerge once they were fully inside the system. Transportation deepened this fear. Prisoners were moved by truck, train, and ship. Conditions varied. Some journeys were uncomfortable. Others were orderly but tense. Guards spoke little. Information was scarce. Prisoners were rarely told where they were going. This silence allowed imagination to fill the gaps, and imagination, shaped by years of indoctrination, was ruthless. As transports moved toward ports, rumors spread rapidly. Someone had overheard an English word that sounded ominous. Someone else claimed to know a man who had disappeared in a British camp during the First World War. Old stories resurfaced, distorted and magnified. Fear became communal. It was shared, reinforced, rarely questioned. Crossing the Channel carried symbolic weight. For German soldiers, Britain was not just another enemy territory, it was the ideological opposite of the Reich. A maritime empire that had resisted invasion. A society portrayed as decadent yet resilient. To be taken there as a prisoner felt like being brought into the heart of enemy power, not to be killed, but to be observed. Many prisoners later recalled the moment they realized they were approaching Britain. The smell of the sea, the sound of gulls, the shape of the coastline. For some, it was unmistakable. For others, it was confirmed only after disembarkation. But in that moment, fear became precise. This was the place they had been warned about for years. Arrival did not match expectation. There were no shouting crowds, no violence, no dramatic displays. British ports were busy, functional, often damaged by bombing. Prisoners were unloaded, counted, and directed onward. British guards maintained distance. Instructions were brief. Tone was neutral. This restraint felt deliberate, almost staged. For many prisoners, the absence of hostility was more disturbing than hostility itself. They scanned faces for signs of hatred. They listened for insults. They watched for arbitrary punishment. Instead, they saw efficiency, paperwork, order. Belief does not shatter easily. When reality contradicts expectation, the mind often delays judgment. German prisoners interpreted early British behavior as temporary. They assumed harsher treatment would follow once formal processing began. Camps, they believed, would reveal the truth. British prisoner of war camps varied widely. Some were converted military bases, others were newly constructed. Many were located in rural areas, far from cities. To German prisoners, this isolation reinforced suspicion. Remote camps, they believed, existed to hide mistreatment. Distance meant invisibility. As prisoners were transported inland, often by train, they observed Britain through narrow windows, fields, villages, farms, civilians going about daily life. This too was unsettling. Britain appeared ordinary, not the decaying, chaotic society they had been shown. Yet this observation created cognitive tension. If British society was stable, then where did cruelty hide? The mind searched for explanations. Nazi propaganda had prepared soldiers for hostility from civilians. They expected insults, spitting, or silent hatred. Instead, many encountered indifference. British civilians rarely interacted with prisoners at all. When they did, it was often brief, controlled, neutral. This neutrality was not kindness, but it was not hatred either. It offered no emotional release. For prisoners conditioned to expect violence, indifference felt like another tactic. It suggested control, confidence, a society unthreatened by their presence. Within holding camps, processing continued. Names recorded, units noted, medical checks conducted. Prisoners were issued basic supplies. Nothing extravagant, nothing cruel. For many Germans, this procedural fairness felt unreal. They searched for hidden consequences. None were immediately visible. At this stage, fear transformed. It did not disappear. It became quieter, more analytical. Prisoners began to question not what would happen, but when. They believed the system was larger than the individuals they encountered. Individual guards might be restrained. The institution, they assumed, would not be. The psychological burden of this waiting was heavy. Many prisoners later described the first days in Britain as emotionally exhausting, not because of suffering, but because of suspended expectation. Their mental energy was consumed by vigilance. Every instruction, every silence, every routine action was examined for hidden meaning. Food became a focal point. German soldiers had been told British rations were deliberately inadequate, designed to weaken prisoners slowly. Initial meals did not confirm this. They were simple, functional, comparable in some cases to what British soldiers themselves ate. This created internal conflict. Some prisoners refused to eat immediately, suspecting manipulation. Others ate cautiously, waiting for consequences. Language barriers intensified isolation. Most German prisoners spoke little English. British guards spoke little German. Communication was minimal. This lack of explanation allowed fear to persist. Silence became a canvas for belief. By the time prisoners reached permanent camps, exhaustion had dulled fear but not erased it. Camps were fenced, guarded, and regulated. They looked like camps. That familiarity reassured belief. This was the environment they had been prepared for. Order could coexist with cruelty. The real test, they believed, had not yet come. The first night in a British camp was often described as sleepless, not because of noise, but because of anticipation. Prisoners lay awake listening, waiting for doors to open, waiting for guards to return, waiting for punishment. Nothing happened. Days passed. Routines were established. Roll calls, meals, work assignments, medical checks. Again, nothing happened. No brutality, no humiliation rituals, no ideological lectures. This absence created a slow fracture in certainty. But at this stage, the fracture was incomplete. Many prisoners clung to belief through reinterpretation. They told themselves this was a long-term strategy. Britain wanted to appear humane. Real consequences would come later, perhaps through forced labor, perhaps through isolation, perhaps through psychological manipulation. This belief allowed fear to survive without immediate evidence. It also preserved identity. To accept that propaganda had been false would require acknowledging betrayal, not only by the regime, but by one's own trust. As weeks passed, German prisoners began to exchange observations quietly. They compared experiences. No one had been beaten. No one had been starved. Discipline existed, but it followed rules. Punishments, when applied, were predictable. This consistency was destabilizing. It did not fit the narrative. Yet even then, belief did not collapse fully. Many prisoners postponed judgment. They believed the true test of British captivity lay ahead, in labor details, in winter, in prolonged confinement, in subtle erosion of morale. At this point, the psychological tension reached its peak. Expectation and reality stood face to face, unresolved. German prisoners had arrived in Britain carrying fear as armor. That armor had not yet been shattered, but it had been dented. The moment of arrival had passed. The first contact had occurred, and nothing terrible had happened. The question that now haunted these men was no longer whether Britain would reveal its cruelty. It was whether everything they had been taught to believe could survive what they were beginning to see. In February 1944, the realization arrived quietly, without announcement or drama. It did not come through violence or confrontation. It emerged instead through repetition, through mornings that followed nights without incident, through routines that remained unchanged, through the slow accumulation of ordinary days. German prisoners in Britain began to understand that the moment they had been waiting for was not coming. This recognition did not bring relief. It brought instability. For men conditioned to expect cruelty, the absence of it was not comforting. It was disorienting. Certainty had been replaced by ambiguity, and ambiguity was harder to endure. Fear had once been focused, directed toward a known threat. Now it had nowhere to go. it turned inward. British camps functioned with quiet regularity. Roll calls happened at the same time each day. Meals arrived predictably. Work details were announced calmly. Medical inspections were conducted without spectacle. Guards enforced rules, but rarely raised their voices. For German prisoners, this consistency felt unnatural. Systems, they believed, were designed to break people. Yet this system appeared designed to maintain order, not dominance. Silence became the most powerful contradiction. British guards did not explain themselves. They did not justify their authority. They did not lecture prisoners about defeat or ideology. Orders were given simply because they were orders. This lack of ideological pressure was deeply unsettling. German prisoners had been trained to expect indoctrination everywhere. Its absence suggested something worse, or something they could not name. The camps themselves were clean. Not luxurious, but functional. Barracks were maintained. Sanitation existed. There were inspections, but they focused on health rather than punishment. For many prisoners, cleanliness felt like a psychological attack. It undermined the narrative of neglect they had prepared for. Dirt and deprivation were supposed to confirm enemy cruelty. Order did the opposite. Food remained a constant source of anxiety. Each meal was examined for hidden intention. Portions were measured, ingredients noted. Over time, it became impossible to deny a basic truth. British rations were not designed to starve prisoners. They were designed to sustain them. This realization did not inspire gratitude. It inspired suspicion. Prisoners asked themselves why an enemy would bother. Work assignments intensified this confusion. German prisoners were often sent to farms, construction sites, or maintenance crews. Labor was expected, but it followed rules. Hours were defined. Rest periods existed. Injuries were treated. In some cases, British civilians supervised work details with quiet professionalism. They did not insult prisoners. They did not provoke them. They treated them as laborers, not enemies. This neutrality was more destabilizing than hostility. Hatred would have confirmed belief. Indifference eroded it. As weeks passed, prisoners began to notice something more unsettling than physical treatment. They noticed psychological space, time to think, time to observe, time without constant threat. In Germany, even rest was ideological. Songs, speeches, symbols filled every gap. In British camps, silence filled the space instead. This silence forced reflection. Prisoners replayed what they had been told. They compared it with what they experienced. The gap between the two widened slowly, painfully. For some, this produced anger, not toward Britain, but toward the voices that had promised suffering and delivered uncertainty. Diaries from this period reveal a common theme: confusion expressed as fatigue. Men wrote not about hunger or pain, but about disbelief, about the difficulty of reconciling expectation with observation. One prisoner described feeling unarmed without fear. Another wrote that he felt more threatened by kindness than by cruelty, because kindness demanded explanation. British politeness became a subject of intense scrutiny. Guards said please. They said thank you. They followed procedure. This behavior was not warm, it was controlled, but it contradicted everything German prisoners had been taught about British arrogance. Politeness, once described as a mask for sadism, appeared instead as habit, routine courtesy, not strategy. This realization caused psychological fragmentation. Some prisoners clung to belief by reframing reality. They told themselves Britain could afford kindness because Germany was already defeated. Others insisted the real cruelty was hidden in boredom, in routine, in the slow erosion of purpose. These explanations preserved ideology while acknowledging evidence. But for many, the collapse came gradually and without drama. A moment when a guard returned a dropped item. A moment when a sick prisoner was excused from work. A moment when a British civilian offered water without being asked. These moments accumulated. They did not convert belief into admiration. They converted certainty into doubt. Doubt was dangerous. It did not remain contained. Once propaganda cracked in one area, it weakened elsewhere. Prisoners began questioning other narratives they had accepted: the invincibility of the right, the moral decay of enemy societies, the inevitability of German victory. These ideas had been interconnected. When one failed, others trembled. British authorities did not rush this process. They did not exploit it openly. There were no lectures designed to humiliate prisoners, no forced viewings of propaganda. The approach was indirect. British officials understood that belief systems collapse more thoroughly when left alone with contradictory evidence. Information filtered in gradually. Newspapers were sometimes made available. Radio broadcasts could be heard at a distance. News of Allied advances reached camps. For prisoners who had been shielded from bad news, this information was shocking, not because it was hostile, but because it was factual. It aligned with observable reality. The psychological impact of this alignment was severe. When propaganda collapses, it does not simply disappear. It leaves a vacuum. German prisoners struggled with identity. Who were they if the enemy was not what they had been told? What did their suffering mean if belief had been manipulated? This internal conflict manifested in subtle ways: increased silence, withdrawal, restlessness. Some prisoners became obsessively rule-following. Others became apathetic. The mind searched for stability where certainty had been. British camps recorded these effects indirectly. Medical officers noted anxiety without obvious cause, insomnia, irritability, depression. These symptoms were not the result of mistreatment. They were the result of cognitive collapse. Post-war interviews and memoirs confirm this pattern. Many former prisoners recalled that the hardest part of captivity was not confinement, but realization, the moment they understood they had been lied to. Not about everything, but about something fundamental. This realization did not produce immediate rebellion or gratitude. It produced mourning. Mourning for lost certainty, for trust misplaced, for years spent believing in a distorted image of the world. Importantly, this psychological shock extended beyond individuals. It influenced how Germany rebuilt memory after the war. Returning prisoners carried stories that did not fit neatly into narratives of victimhood or righteousness. They had experienced an enemy who did not behave as expected. This complicated simple explanations of defeat. British captivity mattered because it exposed the limits of propaganda. It demonstrated that belief systems built on fear are fragile when confronted with sustained contradiction. Not dramatic contradiction, but quiet, consistent reality. The British did not need to prove moral superiority. They did not need to convince prisoners of anything. Their system worked because it did not argue. It functioned. And then functioning, it revealed an alternative to what prisoners had been taught. By the end of the war, many German prisoners left Britain changed, but not transformed into admirers. They left with questions, with uncertainty, with a more complex understanding of enemies and themselves. This complexity mattered. It challenged the idea that war is sustained only by weapons. It showed that war is sustained by belief. And that belief, once broken, cannot be easily repaired. The struggle German prisoners faced in understanding Britain was not cultural alone. It was psychological. Britain did not match the image they had prepared for. And when reality refuses to cooperate with expectation, the mind must either adapt or fracture. In British camps, adaptation happened slowly, quietly, without ceremony. And that quiet collapse of certainty may have been one of the most powerful and least visible consequences of captivity during the war.